Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm Lance Smith, your host, and this is episode 269. Today we're tackling a pair of alleged contradictions from the Skeptic's Annotated Bible. And since there are really two sides of the same coin, we're going to handle them together. The questions are, when did Jesus curse the fig tree, before or after cleansing the temple? And when did the tree die? Immediately or the next morning? Now, on the surface, I'll admit these are fair questions. And if you're reading quickly, Matthew and Mark can seem to tell the story in a different order. And whenever that happens, the skeptics are quick to say, see, somebody got their facts mixed up. But as we've seen many times before on this podcast, sometimes what looks like a contradiction is really just a difference in emphasis. Let's start with Mark's account. We're going to be reading Mark 11, 12 to 15 from the New Living Translation. The next morning, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off. So he went over to see if he could find any figs. But there were only leaves because it was too early in the season for fruit. Then Jesus said to the tree, "May no one ever eat your fruit again." And the disciples heard him say it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple. So in Mark's telling, the order is pretty straightforward. Jesus curses the fig tree first, and then cleanses the temple. Now let's continue with Mark 11, 20 to 21. The next morning, as they passed by the fig tree he had cursed, the disciples noticed it had withered from the roots up. Peter remembered what Jesus had said to the tree on the previous day and exclaimed, "Look, Rabbi, the fig tree you cursed has withered and died." So in Mark's account, Jesus curses the tree on day 1, and the disciples notice its withered condition the following morning. Now, let's turn to Matthew's account, and these are our focus verses today. Let's read Matthew 21, 12 to 13, and then 18 to 19. Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out all the people buying and selling animals for sacrifice. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. Then he returned to Bethany, where he stayed overnight. Early the next morning, Jesus was returning to the city. He was hungry, and he noticed a fig tree beside the road. He went over to see if there were any figs, but there were only leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." And immediately the fig tree withered up. Matthew arranges the account differently, recording the temple cleansing and then moving directly to the fig tree episode the next morning. All right, let's continue with Matthew 21, 19 to 20. And immediately the fig tree withered up. The disciples were amazed when they saw this and asked, "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" In Matthew's telling, Jesus curses the tree, and the disciples immediately notice the miracle taking place. So a quick review. Mark tells us Jesus leaves Bethany, sees a fig tree with leaves, finds no fruit, and curses it. Then Jesus enters Jerusalem, drives out the money changers from the temple. The following morning, the disciples notice the tree is withered from the roots. Matthew tells the same story differently. He records the temple cleansing first, then the fig tree episode, and says the tree withered immediately. And that's exactly why skeptics point to these passages. At first glance, the order and timing don't seem to line up. So what's going on here? Have we actually found a genuine contradiction, or are Matthew and Mark simply emphasizing different details of the same event? I think it's the latter, and here's why. Okay, one possibility would be to assume somebody made a mistake. But before we jump there, let's remember something important. The gospel writers weren't trying to write 21st century minute-by-minute timelines. They were writing reliable accounts of real events while also highlighting theological truths. Think of it like two sports reporters covering the same football game. One writes a play-by-play recap. The other organizes his article around the game's turning points. The same game, same facts, different presentation. That's exactly what many scholars believe is happening here. Mark appears to give us a fuller chronological sequence. In fact, Mark loves what scholars call intercalation, a fancy word for a sandwich. He starts one story, inserts another story in the middle, and then comes back to finish the first story. The fig tree and temple cleansing fit that pattern perfectly. In fact, Mark seems to be inviting us to interpret the two events together. Greg Lanier, in his excellent Gospel Coalition article, Why Did Jesus Curse the Fig Tree?, points out that the cursing of the tree functions as an enacted parable. In other words, Jesus isn't simply expressing frustration because breakfast didn't work out. He's teaching something through a real event. And what is he teaching? The tree looked healthy from a distance. Lots of leaves, lots of promise. But when Jesus got close, there was no fruit. David Guzik makes a similar observation in his enduring word commentary on Mark 11. He describes the tree as a picture of spiritual false advertising. That's a phrase I think most of us understand. We've all experienced that. You order a burger because the menu picture looks incredible. Now, what arrives at your table looks like it was assembled during a minor earthquake. Lots of appearance, but not much substance. That was Jesus' point about the religious leadership of the day. Now, let's tackle the timing question. Did the tree wither immediately, as Matthew says, or the next day, as Mark says? Evidence Unseen offers what I think is the simplest explanation. The curse took effect immediately, but the full results became visible later. And that's not unusual at all. If you've ever sprayed weed killer on your driveway, you know the weeds didn't instantly collapse into dust. The process begins immediately, but the visible evidence becomes obvious later. Matthew focuses on the beginning of the miracle. Mark focuses on when the disciples observed the completed result. Both statements can be true at the same time. GotQuestions.org reaches a very similar conclusion, noting that the withering likely began at once, while becoming fully apparent by the next morning when the disciples passed the tree again. In fact, Mark gives us an interesting detail. He says the tree had withered from the roots. That's a clue that something deeper was happening than merely a few leaves drying up. The judgment started at the source. And that's what makes this symbolism so powerful. The issue wasn't merely outward behavior. The problem was at the root. Keel, in his research paper on the temple cleansing and the cursing of the fig tree, argues that the two events are intentionally connected. The fruitless tree becomes a picture of judgment against an unfruitful religious system. The temple looked impressive. The ceremonies were taking place. The crowds were gathering. But spiritually speaking, the fruit wasn't there. The connection becomes even stronger when we remember that Jesus cleanses the temple right in the middle of the fig tree narrative in Mark's gospel. That's not an accident. That's two stories interpret one another. Another interesting perspective comes from Andrew Simmonds' article, Cursing the Fig Tree in Mark. Simmonds explores some broader symbolic possibilities from the cultural world of the first century. While some of his conclusions are more specialized than I'd be comfortable building a podcast around, his work does remind us that the biblical symbolism often carried layers of meaning that ancient audiences would have recognized more readily than we do today. Gutenberg University's analysis notes that this miracle is unusual because it's one of the few miracles of judgment recorded in Jesus' ministry, underscoring his authority not only to bless, but also to judge. Their discussion also emphasizes genuine faith, fruitfulness, and God's expectations for his people. Likewise, Catholic.com highlights the contrast between outward appearance and inward reality. And honestly, that's where this passage starts stepping on our toes a little, because it's easy to read the story and focus on the tree. Jesus wants us to focus on ourselves. As Greg Lanier reminds us, this isn't merely a lesson about ancient Israel. It's a warning for all of God's people in every generation. Are we producing fruit? Or are we just displaying leaves? That's really the question Jesus wanted his audience to wrestle with, and it's still the question for us today. As somebody who spent decades in the corporate world before retirement, I've seen plenty of situations where the reports looked fantastic, the presentations were polished, and the meetings sounded impressive. But when you dug into the actual results, there wasn't much fruit on the tree. The same danger exists spiritually. We can attend church, know the vocabulary, carry the Bible, and still miss what God is producing in our hearts. That's why this passage remains so relevant. The alleged contradiction disappears once we recognize the different purposes of Matthew and Mark. Mark emphasizes chronology. Matthew emphasizes the lesson. The tree began withering immediately and was visibly dead by the next morning. No contradiction. Just two gospel writers standing at different angles, giving us a fuller picture of the same event. And more importantly, a powerful reminder that Jesus desires more than appearances. He desires genuine faith that bears fruit. If today's episode helped strengthen your faith or gave you a useful answer for somebody else's questions, I'd appreciate it if you'd share the podcast with a friend. You can support the podcast at buymeacoffee.com/Lance Smith. Always appreciated, never expected. Every episode is available at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Bible Difficulties and Answers, or email me at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com. I read every message. This is Lance Smith, wishing you good health, good study, and God's richest blessings. We'll see you next time. So long, everybody.